Okay, so my name's Mel, as you've all gathered by now. I live at Laughton Lodge, which is a former learning disability hospital in the village of Laughton, which is about 8 miles outside Lewes, about 20 miles from here. I was asked to come and talk to you about the story of Laughton Lodge, and so that's what I'm going to do. And it will be a combination of the story of Laughton Lodge and my story with Laughton Lodge, so it's sort of Laughton Lodge and me. And you're very welcome to interrupt at any time. It's a 20-year story, probably more than that now, and I'm going to try and not make it sound too long. But we start at the beginning in 1995, which seems an enormously long time ago now. And in 1995, one fine day, there I was, reading The Guardian, which didn't look like that, and happened to read that bit of The Guardian that I didn't normally ever read, which was some kind of property supplement that they had at the time. And in it was an advert saying that there was a group forming that wanted to form an intentional community, and anybody who was interested to get in touch. So we got in touch. And I remember we got invited to an initial meeting, and I remember saying to my husband, you know, we can leave at any time. It'll be absolutely fine. We can just walk out. We don't need to worry about this. We can go. Hi. But off we went and found it to be a presentation organised in a training venue somewhere in Kingston, and they seemed very together. And basically the they was about 4 or 5 other families who've been together for a couple of years and had started looking for somewhere that they could convert into a larger community. They modelled themselves at the time on another community in Worcestershire or Herefordshire called Redfield, which some of you may be aware of. And nobody then, in mid-1990s, acknowledged that this was called cohousing. It was just a form of intentional community. But as the research went on and more work was done to find out about other models, it became apparent that what we were trying to do was fundamentally what the Americans and the Scandinavians called cohousing. And I don't need to explain perhaps to all of you, but I will anyway. The sort of key characteristics that form part of the model that the Laughton Lodge, what became the Laughton Lodge group, latched onto was the notion that you had your own completely normal living space. I have to keep explaining this to people. We have our own houses which have all the things that you have in any ordinary house, like a kitchen and all that sort of thing. But you also have shared community space and shared outdoor spaces. And that was very much what this group was trying to achieve. I think it's very interesting when you look back to think about what it was that brought the group together in the first place. You know, what were the motivations? And I've always found it quite interesting to kind of go back through people's backgrounds and discover that there's an awful lot of people, certainly in the founding group, perhaps less so in those who've come subsequently, who have some kind of institutional experience, if you like. So they're either the children of army parents, or they're the children, as in my case, of people who taught in a boarding school environment, and so have grown up in some kind of a community. So, you know, my parents taught in boarding schools. I played all the time with other children of those people, and we had a whole social thing that went on with it. And you get very used to this notion that you have a lot of space and a lot of friends, and they come and go, and you have some sense of belonging, and then seek it out for your own children, I suppose. The group had already looked at 2 or 3 properties, including some really quite seriously, in which they'd done some quite serious work on it. But by the time we joined them, they were just at the point of losing what had been a former naval college in Portsmouth, and had abandoned the pursuit of what had been a former monastery somewhere in Somerset. And that, I think, had been a really useful learning experience, which I'm quite glad we didn't have to go through, in which they realised that listed buildings aren't great, and that former institutions have a lot more going for them in many ways, and that you need quite a bit of space around it ideally. So the former naval college, which was being left as a former naval college in the middle of what was otherwise a large housing development around it, was going to be a strange place to live, and probably just as well it fell through. However, we'd joined the group, I suppose, in about 1995, and then in 1997, Laughton Lodge Hospital came on the market. Laughton Lodge Hospital had been a learning disability hospital. It was built in 1939. It had started to become redundant, I think, relatively soon after that, actually. I think after the war, attitudes had already started to change. Large parts of it had been unused for at least 10 years before we found it. And the final move out had been a few years prior to that, so probably it had been standing empty and derelict for about 2 years, and parts of it had been derelict for probably 10 years before that. 23 acres around it. The sale has 3 lots, which was the main hospital buildings and the land immediately around it, and then a couple of other fields and woods adjoining it. It had the huge advantage that those 1939 villas, which that is a very typical example, divide up into very equal sorts of houses. So none of this ballroom and servants' quarters business that had been the case with the monastery and some of the other places that people had rather liked. There's a lot of similarity and equality about it, and so that makes it a much more equal place to live in once you've finally arrived. And we went to look at it and all thought that this would be great. And that was the start of quite a long story. So having espied this place and decided that we were going to buy it, we then actually had to get our act together. So having been a relatively informal group for quite a long time, the first thing we had to do was to form some kind of a legal structure in order to be able to actually buy the building. We opted for a company limited by guarantee. We could have gone for various other structures. Quite a lot of the structures that exist now didn't exist in 1997, so some of the options that people would now choose weren't available. The main alternative was a friendly society. I've forgotten what they're now called, but it's much more mutual. But we opted in the end for a company limited by guarantee because everybody else in the outside world understands what a company is, and they are therefore prepared to do business with you without going, what's that? And it's a very simple structure. It costs next to nothing to set up, and it's really easy to run. So that was what we went for, even though there was some sense that it didn't quite encompass the sense of mutuality. Everybody then became a director, and that has then been written into the whole structure that we operate now, in which you have to be a director in order to be a leaseholder, and a leaseholder has to be a director, so that it's all tied in together and everybody runs the company that owns the building. We then had to undertake very quickly some kind of a feasibility study in order to work out whether or not it would be possible to divide it up in the way we had intended, and also what sort of number of dwellings we were likely to get out of it. I think at that stage we probably had a group of fairly serious people of around 15 households. And we also had to understand whether or not the buildings themselves were in the sort of state that was going to be possible to do a conversion of, or whether actually you were looking at a much more wholesale renovation or even demolition and rebuilding. And also to look at the potential for self-build, some additional self-build units for the people who wanted to do that, and also to look at what the impact of some additional self-build units would be on the overall finances of the project. So the result of that feasibility study was to say that it was feasible, indeed highly feasible. So then we had to move on to, okay, well now we need to find some money to actually buy this site, and then indeed to fund the conversion. So then we're into, can we get a loan? And we start off going to all the possible sources of lending, which again were fewer than they possibly are now, and got into this endless cycle of the high street banks said, no, this is too strange, this is too unusual, we need something more conventional, and the sort of eco banks like Triodos and that sort of outfit said, no, this is too conventional, it's not eco enough, it's not interesting, it doesn't fulfill our criteria. So I was like, oh, okay, so we're too conventional but we're not conventional enough, we're too mainstream but we're not mainstream enough. In the end, to cut a very long story short, we persuaded Triodos that actually we were sufficiently unconventional for them to be able to consider us, which they did. So we now have a loan offer in our back pockets, and we can move on to putting in an offer to buy this hospital site. And all of this is taking place in a really quite short period of time, because once a property comes on the market, you haven't got months and months to sit around getting loans and working out what your legal structure is going to be. So we put in an offer, and the agents do this sort of, that's very interesting, thanks very much. Now would you all put in your best and final offers kind of thing. So we went round that, and it was a whole sealed bid thing. And you also have to remember that these were the days before email, before WhatsApp groups, before all that sort of thing. So basically all this kind of discussion and negotiation is occurring on conference calls by phone, which are all booked in advance, and through telephone trees in which information is cascaded, and through the occasional fax, which seems like the height of advanced technology, because it's a really quick way of getting a document from here to there. When you look back, you wonder how it was possible to communicate at all, to be honest. People were spread all across London primarily, and some in Sussex as well. So we agree on a best and final offer, have a long kind of, oh my God, should we be going for the woods or not? What if we make it conditional? No, maybe not. Oh dear, what should we do? Put in our best and final offer, send off our ambassadors to the offices of the estate agent, or I think it was the health authority in Croydon somewhere, to deliver this thing, sit back and wait and see what happens. Good news, you've got it, it's yours. Great celebrations. Week later, sorry, somebody's put in a higher offer, we're taking it back. Oh no, what shall we do now? The higher offer was put in by a developer who wanted to put 100 houses on the land. Inevitably, Wealdon District Council said no. The developer tried to get us to come in with them and have kind of a strip of the land for our little bit while he put houses on the rest of it. But no, that wasn't. So in the end, we get it back again. At that point, realising just how restrictive the planning conditions are, we think, okay. And a whole renegotiation goes on. And in the end, we got it for £400,000, which is an amazing thing to think of, really. So that's great. So we do that and we get it. And so now we own 23 acres of land and some knackered old hospital buildings, which is great, and I feel really good about it. However, it's not really somewhere you can live, not in any meaningful kind of way. So then that moves us into the next phase of it all. So the first thing was to get on board a professional team. So we needed an architect, a quantity surveyor, and some other professionals to do some of the other elements of that. And I do remember that we went in for a whole business of writing tenders, interviewing people, and I think we're remarkably lucky in the end in getting an architect's company based in Tunbridge Wells who were really into this kind of way of developing new buildings. And for the lead partner in that architectural practice, this was a real personal and professional development opportunity, and indeed he almost bought one of the houses in the end. So he was really very personally committed to it, and that made a huge difference. And we also got on board a quantity surveyor who's my type of man. Basically his view was, this is all entirely possible, it won't cost very much, you pare it all back, it will all be fine. So great. And then we got to the whole planning issue. At that point, the whole thing went into a bit of a black hole. We own 23 acres and some knackered old buildings. The local authority isn't particularly keen on us. They wanted it to be another institution, because they wanted to preserve the jobs. The village community isn't particularly keen on us. I think it turns out that was largely because the local farmers kind of wanted to get their hands on the land, but they presented us as a cult and consequently a danger to their children. And so we're faced with quite a lot of blocks to actually proceeding. We got into doing all sorts of things which I would, at that stage, never normally have done in my life, like ringing up councillors, after they've had their dinner and trying to persuade them that this is actually a really good idea, putting our most articulate members into their best suits and sending them down to the village to discuss it with the parish council, trying to make sure our children behaved really, really well in the pub, all these sorts of things. And at the same time as trying to get the planning permission for the buildings to be converted, also trying to get planning permission for 6 additional new build houses. That's completely contrary to the local plan. That's a kind of no-no, absolutely not. So a lot of work went on around that. Again, to cut a very long story short, in the end we got planning permission to convert the villas into, I think it's 16 or 17 houses, but with a very restrictive Section 106 agreement imposed upon it, which fundamentally takes away all our residual planning rights. So while the rest of you are allowed to put up a shed in your garden whenever you want and things like that, we can't do any of that without additional planning permission. And also a restriction on ever splitting up the site, so we can't sell off bits of land for other development purposes. That's not allowed either, and all kinds of things like that. And eventually, with the support, I have to say, of a couple of villagers who were quite influential on the District Council Planning Committee, we got planning permission for 4 new houses on the grounds that without them the whole development wasn't financially viable, and if the development wasn't financially viable, the local authority and the village were going to be left with a site with a decaying set of hospital buildings on it and nothing happening. So from their point of view, and in the background a threat that this would then become an open prison. And I think it was those factors that the alternative use for the site was an open prison. So with those factors in mind, they agreed the additional 4, not 6 houses, but not before the planning application. The planning agreement had been called in to in those days they had regional government officers, that was called in and then eventually called in by what was then the Department of Environment for an inquiry. So it was quite a to-do. And I do remember ringing up the woman in Guildford who was responsible for calling in planning applications and saying, well, what happens now? And she said no planning applicant had ever before phoned her to find out what the process was, because they were always developers and they always knew what it was. So it was the first time that any individual had actually had their planning application called in like that. Anyway, we got the planning application in the end.
How long was the process then for that beginning?
That must have been getting on for a year.
It was a year.
Yeah, getting on that sort of, probably 8, 9 months, something like that, with all that. And every time you thought you were almost there, another thing happens and you're not back again.
And had you bought the land, you've got the loan for that, so you're paying interest all the time you're going through this planning stuff, all of you?
Yeah.
And you've all chipped in as a group to cover that 400 grand?
Well, they'd agreed to roll up to not start charging, for us not to start paying back until we actually started building. So.
Okay, so they were covering that. You had a loan for the 400
grand. But of course,
grand.
interest is
cumulative.
It's cumulative. But actually. Well, we'll come back to how the finances worked in the end. So now we're able to actually go out to tender for a building contract, because now we're actually allowed to turn these houses into, which we own, into so off we go with our helpful quantity surveyor and out to tender. Oh, he says it'll cost about 600,000. So we sit back and wait, and then come the tenders. The lowest was £1 million. Oh my God, now what? And I so vividly remember sitting with one of the other directors, looking at this, thinking, we're 400,000 adrift. We've costed all this up. We've got people who really can't afford much more than that would have turned out to be. What are we going to do? So we took a red pen. I think it's a picture. So we took a red pen and started just striking things out. So. All the nice things, out they go, all the grey water recycling, all the organic paint, all this stuff, out it goes. And it's stripped back to the very, very bare minimum requirements. And to the point that although building control will not allow you to sign up a house unless it's got a kitchen in, they will define a kitchen as having simply a sink. So that was, there was going to be one sink moved around every kitchen, so building control was slightly so we made these major cuts, finally agreed, get a single contractor. The other issue was whether or not we should get a single contractor, because there had been a strong view that we should basically get a small contractor who would do walls and a small contractor who would do roofs and so on and so forth. But the lender wouldn't allow us to do that. They insisted on a single contractor, and so that was non-negotiable. And I think with hindsight that was probably right. I think that they were right on that, and I think I've watched enough grand design, so I'm sure you have to see that if you do go down that route, although it appears a much cheaper way of operating, actually it becomes much, much more complicated to manage. So I think in the end we were grateful to them about that. So we now have, I suppose, the best part of 18 months or so of project management to undertake. What we didn't do was to appoint a paid project manager, so beyond the role that the architect took in coordinating the rest of the professional team, we didn't have a paid project manager, we did it ourselves. And we set up this thing called the E-team, which then sort of went into mythology as some kind of, you know, Soviet thing, but was really a way of making sure that there was some kind of line of communication between the community project and each of the professionals. So the E-team comprised about 5 or 6 people, each one of whom shadowed one of the professionals. So one person shadowed the architect, one the quantity surveyor, one did the finance, and so on and so forth. And I got the quantity surveyor, which was an absolutely huge education, and you know, I learned, I knew nothing, absolutely nothing. You look back on it and you think, mad, completely mad. Why would you put somebody who knows absolutely nothing in charge of liaising with the quantity surveyor? But, you know, it worked out. So we would meet weekly to coordinate what was happening with our different professionals and what was going on the ground. They had the professional team had their own meetings at the same time, and also to work out the cash flow, which obviously became really critical. We also introduced a duty management system, so there was somebody down on site in the office every weekday morning, most of the time doing very little, but available to deal with anything that the contractor came up with and to get a decision using the aforesaid telephone tree. So, you know, and as the build went on, I mean, you know, we started off, well, that's fine, let's build some walls and things, but it became much more sort of, well, now they're going to put the doors in 3 days' time, so you've all got to decide on the doors, you know, and that kind of thing. So it was quite a busy thing, and we did all have jobs and families as well. So you have to really want it, I think, is the outcome of that. But it was incredibly exciting, I do also say that. Then financing, the way we did that was we had the loan available, but what people did was to start selling their houses in preparation for moving down. So every time somebody sold their house, they put the money into the communal pot. So we kept getting relatively large injections of cash every time somebody sold their house. All those people selling their houses then moved on site and lived in caravans. Again, sort of contrary to planning law, but you know, nevertheless. And we had an agreed system that anybody who put cash in got, sorry.
Why is that contrary to planning?
Because you're not supposed to do that. You're not
What are you meant to do while you're still
but
building
not
a
the
house?
planning authority's problem. And if you live on site in a caravan, you're supposed to live on site in a caravan, not to sort of use the buildings and that kind of thing, because it's not supposed to be, you know, and you're supposed to be paying council tax and, you know, all these sorts of things. So it's not really allowed to keep on that. So we had an agreement that anybody who put money in, that accrued a notional rate of interest, which was slightly above base rate, and so that interest on the money you were putting in then was offset against your house price eventually. And we also had a very complicated system of guarantees, because people who were putting their money in, at any point this project could have become unviable and crashed, and there were 1 or 2 points when it was, you know, I don't think it wasn't going to, but it got a bit more anxious inducing. So there was an agreement that were it to all go belly up and the whole thing became bankrupt, that those losses would be shared amongst all members of the group, not just those who put the money in. I think in hindsight that was really, really helpful in getting people to put the money in, and probably really, really meaningless had anything actually happened. But you know, you need a comfort blanket, and that was sort of what we had. And so we also had sort of agreements about, by that time the houses had all been allocated to individual families, so we had some agreements about that as well. And we had so we had the internal guarantee system, and we also had loan agreements between the individual members of the project and the project as a whole. So when you put your money in, you had a loan agreement, each family had that. And then pricing, once the units were finally completed, they had to be allocated a price, and nobody knew what that price really was going to be until quite near the point at which they actually bought them. And that pricing was done on a square footage basis, so we put all the sort of infrastructure costs, the cost of the site, all the legal costs, all the professional fees and all that sort of thing into a single figure, and then divided it up into a unit a square footage unit cost. So each house then had a basic price, which was however many square feet it was, as a share of those total costs, plus a very complicated desirability rating thing in which an estate agent was hired to go and do a sort of valuation of all the houses and to work out the differentials in terms of which were not size but which were more desirable, and then our own internal desirability procedure where we all sat down one day and said, I think that's nicer than that one, and ranked them all on a 3-point scale, and then combined those two things into a single price for each house, which was probably something that Ravi plucked out of the air, to be perfectly honest. And then you had a house price, plus you then got knocked off it whatever you'd already put in, plus you got knocked off it whatever your notional rate of interest was, so you never got paid interest, so you didn't have to pay tax on it. And there we were. So now we have houses and we've moved in, and that's so we bought the site in 1997. People started moving in towards the end of 1999, and we were all in there sometime during 2000. So a 3-year period in total to get it up and running. We included 30,000 in the infrastructure costs to renovate the common house, which is that, and which is really quite a large building and has been an ongoing issue to some extent, and has become a bigger one now ever since, but provides us with a whole range of communal facilities and spaces. Okay, so now we've got houses, we have to start building the community itself. I think the actual process of building houses like that, the commitment that's required, the financial risk that you take, the energy that's needed, because the E-team was meeting every week on a Tuesday evening. The rest of the group were meeting minimum fortnightly on a weekend, and at some stages weekly on a weekend down on site. You don't do anything out, and you have to keep your job going and somehow bring up your children, but you certainly, your friends all gone somewhere else, and you don't do anything else that's interesting. So it does become a kind of total immersion, and I think that in itself actually builds community perhaps more than almost anything else, really, because you have been on such a journey together. You've had so many decisions to make, and you've had to make them. I mean, it's no good saying, well, actually we can't agree on what kind of doors we should have, so let's park that. You've got to have doors, so I think that sort of context provides for a very strong group at the end of the day, which is quite helpful when you first move in and everything's very strange. There was no doubt when we first moved in that the first year or so was quite challenging, because suddenly you're all new to this environment and you've got to find out a way of getting on. There are no gardens, there may be 23 acres of land, but there's no gardens, so you're sharing all that, and you're trying to work out how you're going to live together as a community with this huge idealism that drove you to do it in the first place, and this huge amount of time and energy that you put into trying to make it happen. So now it's really got to be worth it, because you've committed so much over 3 years, or in some people's cases 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So it is quite a big deal, and I don't think any of us had really thought about that. I think we'd all thought, we'll move in, it'll be great, and we moved in and it was complicated. This is our vision statement of now, but we only came up with that a couple of years ago. Prior to that, we didn't really have one, and that possibly wasn't helpful either, in that what we had was everybody's privately articulated view of what the community was supposed to be and what they were supposed to get out of it, which we'd obviously had sessions when you sort of shared it, but actually we've got a thing to build, so that was a nice session. But now please can we get on and decide what kinds of windows we're going to have. So it has very much emerged over time, but a little bit about the structures that we now have. So consensus decision making is built into our Memorandum and Articles of Association. That's the one main way in which those are different from a kind of any standard off-the-shelf company limited by guarantee. So that has proved to be a interesting way of going on. A way of going on that It's not necessarily anything like as obvious as it may sound, that different people's views of what is consensus, what is proper consensus, what is really doing consensus properly, are very different. And so consensus decision making has been both a huge boon but also a considerable source of contention over the years, I would say. I still maintain that it's absolutely vital that if you do move away from it, so this takes so long and I can't be doing with, do we have to make consensus decisions about what type of tomatoes we're going to grow and whether we paint the dining room red, and if so, I'm just not going to have anything else to do it. But I do think it's really, really important, because the last thing you want is anything that says you lost that vote and it's there forever to remind you, or anything which encourages people to become cliquey. So, my friends will vote for me, so I don't need to worry about that. Or you're not my friend anymore because you didn't vote for me. So all that sort of thing, consensus decision making does take away, and I think that is hugely, hugely helpful, even if it's very slow and sometimes contentious, and sometimes people say it's not consensus, it's just a veto, and all that sort of thing. We voted never, or only once, and that was over what the name was, and that's slightly because somehow or other you have to find a way through what a name is. Other than that, we've come close on 2 or 3 occasions and never actually done it. So I think in 20 years that's probably a vote of confidence for consensus decision making. We have monthly main group meetings and a system of subgroups that look after different elements of the management. Subgroups were invented one fine day by one of our directors, who said we must have subgroups, and these are they. And we haven't really moved much away from that. I think it's fairly common sense. There's one that looks after the maintenance of the site, one that looks after the land, one that looks after the facilities, and then a finance subgroup, and then a little bit of shifting around over things like process and whether there should be social activities and things like that have come and gone a bit. But fundamentally we have that structure. We have a monthly busy day. Used to be called a work day until one child said, we need to change the name, I don't want it to be called work day anymore. I associate it with my parents going to work. I don't like my parents going to work, so please can call it busy day. So it has been ever since. And that's when we do jobs around the site together, and nothing's compulsory, and that has always been a principle right from the very, very first days when we started looking for the site and trying to raise the money, was that nothing should ever be compulsory beyond the service charge. There's often been a move towards saying things should be compulsory. There is undoubtedly a strand of opinion that thinks that people should be compelled to put in a certain number of hours work per month, which is very common in American co-housing communities and a bit less so in Scandinavian ones. But conscript armies and volunteer armies are very different animals, and I still think that keeping things voluntary is actually a really good way of making people feel that it's home, because there aren't many homes where things are compulsory in quite that way. So, but it's an issue. I think there's no doubt about it. The finances, these are all pictures of children because children are more photogenic, so I've put more of them, but there are adults living here. So we finance the running of the place now through these things. There's a service charge. The service charge is set on a per square footage now, converted to a per square metre basis. It is written again into the lease that you can change the way that the service charge is calculated, but that would have to be done with everybody's agreement. And we've thought at various times about how you might do it. You could do it on a per head basis, or you could do it, heaven forbid, perhaps on a means basis, or those sorts of things. But have concluded that square footage space stands as quite a good proxy for practically everything else. So a bigger house will probably have more people in it, and if it doesn't have more people in it, they've probably got more money. So it's probably as good a way of doing it as any other, and appears to most people to be fair. So we've always stuck with the square footage basis. When we started, we set it at £1 a square foot, and we've worked from there. And the £1 a square foot was as random as these are going to be the subgroups. We had to pick away at that amount, and that's what we did. And it tends to go up by inflation every year. We had written into the lease that there should be a development charge, specifically to ensure that we got some money each year that could be used for additional projects, so to keep enhancing the site and not just doing the maintenance. That raises about 4,500 a year, so it's not very much, but it is earmarked for those sorts of purposes, which is quite nice. The utilities are all done centrally, so you have to pay your utility charges, which are calculated and take up an enormous amount of time to calculate, and everybody wishes we didn't do it like that, but the electricity has a single meter at the input, and so with everything else. And we also charge rents for space in the common house and other places, which brings us in quite a decent income actually. As you heard, when we first got the contracts back, all the green things had to go because they were so expensive and we had to slash the costs. So we're left with really a biomass heating system, possibly quite green, and really not much more than that. A certain amount of sharing, a certain amount of this sort of thing, but fundamentally a certain amount of vegetable growing, but really it isn't all that green. I think that would be true to say. And because it's right out in the countryside, there are a lot of cars. So it's not an eco-community, and efforts to try and make it one have fallen down most of the time for practicalities as much as anything. We are continuously reinventing ourselves, I think. There's a certain amount of turnover. We didn't get much turnover for the first probably 5 or 6 years. But now there is a certain amount of turnover. With every new family, to some extent you see it again through a new set of eyes, and you have to relook at things. So I think that does make for, I suppose it keeps us on our toes to some extent. It's great that mostly when people move out, the people who move in bring younger children with them, and that keeps it quite lively. And the new energy is great, but of course they also need to understand it all from first principles to some extent. So that does keep happening, which is when you've been through that cycle a few times, it's a kind of interesting process really to watch happening. There are endless possibilities. I think that's one of the great things about it. When you've got a group of people, there are always possibilities for new things to happen. And we have done some really exciting, good, fun things over the years that I would never have done had I lived anywhere else, I'm sure of that. And which certainly for the children would never have happened, I'm sure of that. So that kind of makes it worthwhile and interesting. Working together can be challenging. It isn't necessarily easy. People can be quite difficult. They don't do what you say. They don't do what is obviously right. I can't understand it. So sometimes you want to pack your bags and leave, but I haven't yet. But I think most of all there are endless opportunities to learn. It does really keep you on your toes because there is always something new to do, and because we manage the whole site ourselves, and that is a major part of our existence together, there's a lot you can learn in lots of different areas, and I think that is an enormously valuable and great opportunity from which I've got a lot. You can fulfil some fantasies. I've done that too. And make some deeper connections. Because you have to get to know people in such a different way and recover from from time to time some quite difficult encounters with them, it does change the nature of your relationships, and you understand people in a completely different way. And I suppose above all you understand yourself in a completely different way, and that probably has to be a valuable thing. So there you are, that's it. If anybody wants to ask any questions, you're very welcome.
So you said that you maintain the entire property, like the site, by yourselves. I guess my first question is how many families are there? And then secondly, was anyone kind of paid? Okay, so there are 21 families, makes between 70 and 80 people depending on who those families are at any given time. Has anybody been paid? Well, during the development stage, we paid professionals, so we paid an architect and we paid a quantity surveyor and we paid a heating consultant person, but we didn't pay ourselves. So our management of it was all voluntary, but where we needed professional input, so we're not architects and we can't do architectural drawings and that kind of thing, we obviously had to pay them. We don't have a site manager now. We do pay a cleaner and a caretaker. We don't really pay the caretaker, it's kind of offset, but so not much paying goes on in that sense.
Thank you.
Thanks, that was really interesting. I wanted to ask, of the original families who started the project, how many are still living at Laughton? And the second question I wanted to ask was, you mentioned rent. What sort of proportion of people paying rent are there to members?
Okay, so I think there's about seven of the original families left out of the 21, so we're now down to a minority. And the rent was about renting spaces for officers or storage or things. We couldn't raise any external finance other than a loan to buy the site, so all the houses are owner occupied, paid for. We don't have any rental units. That's always been a thing that a lot of people would like to change, but unless you can get the external finance from somewhere to fund that, you can't have it. When we first found the site, we did go and approach quite a number of housing associations about whether they might like to be a partner, and they didn't want to be a partner. And at the time there weren't any of the sort of schemes that there are now that might have allowed for some rental units to be included, so there's no rental units. Or if there are, they're only privately rented, so sometimes people privately rent, but otherwise not.
Some of the owners privately rent.
Yeah, we'll let out their either a room or the whole house from time to time.
A follow-up to that is that you couldn't develop a scheme in Brighton like that now. You would, if you were developing 21 households, you'd have to have a certain amount that were affordable. It would be 40%. So this scheme now in Brighton, if you were developing it in the same way, the council would only give you planning permission on the basis that you delivered 40% affordable housing. And you'd have the same opportunity as developers currently do in the city, which is you could argy-bargy and say we just can't afford to deliver on 40%, so we'll offer you 20%, the council might cave in and give you that. But you wouldn't, you presumably in your section 106 had no affordability requirement. In those days it wasn't
Nobody
as
thought
common.
of it.
Yeah.
You have to remember we bought this site just after a 10-year slump in housing prices.
Yeah.
Just after, so property was immensely affordable, really, relatively. And,
Relatively.
So it wasn't an issue. There weren't any requirements of that kind. And there weren't any sources of external funding to make it possible either. So very, very different world.
Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to say it was really interesting what you said about the consensus making, and just wanted to ask you to explain a bit further about that. I studied social networks in my research, and I know when social networks or communities are really strong and closed, there's an incredible amount of solidarity on the one hand, but on the other hand there could be prevention of integration of new values and projects and innovative views. And so I'm just wondering if you ever questioned that, and has it ever occurred that you couldn't reach consensus if people have different values, and what did you do in that situation?
We've had 2 or 3 issues where we've come very. We have a default position that if you can't reach consensus after 2 rounds of it, maybe 3, you can vote. And we've come close to that on 2 or 3 occasions, but we've never actually done it. Partly because there's almost a kind of superstitious fear that if you breach it on one occasion, well, then the floodgates will be open and you'll be voting on everything. And as I've said, I think people are quite keen, or certainly the original people were quite keen not to get into voting for lots of reasons. Does it prevent innovative thinking? Possibly. Certainly there have been times in those 20 years when I could sit here and say, you're going to say that, you're going to say that, you're going to say that, and you'll think now. The outcome will be this, I'll have a row with you, you'll walk out, and it has become perhaps a bit stereotyped. But I think that the sort of turnover that we get now possibly stops that happening. As new people come in with whatever innovative, creative thinking they bring, but certainly with no experience, if that's what you're going to say, I know, and sort of mix it up a bit. So I think that's helpful. Does it prevent us? I mean, I wouldn't want to start by pretending that we are a diverse group. I think there's not a lot of diversity in it, and so that might be an issue itself, and we could perhaps be more creative if we were a bit more diverse, but we're not.
And this selection process, or when your family is interested, you just meet and
well, yeah, in theory there's a process that when somebody sells, the community project gets 3 months to find a suitable buyer. The community project hardly ever finds a suitable buyer within 3 months. If the community project finds more than one suitable buyer, then the community project has the right to choose which one to put forward. We did that probably about 2 years ago was the last time that happened. We were so divided over who was the most suitable potential buyer that we resolved never to do it again. Never make the choice, because actually it's the sort of the randomness of people leaving, selling to whoever they sell to, has the greatest advantage of mixing things up. Once you start saying, oh well, we're going to choose that person and they're going to go forward, you have to take responsibility for that choice from the start. So if they turn out to be, difficult in whatever way you might want to define that, well, who can you blame but yourselves? Whereas if they're just people, you find yourself much more open to saying, well, they're just people, we'll accommodate them, we'll find the thing in it. And if they turn out to be difficult in whatever way you might define that, the people who said, well, I told you they were the wrong ones, have more to say about it. So actually, natural selection, I think, has a great deal to be said for it.
It's a very difficult question, so I'm just going to ask it. So you said the village thought you were a cult.
Yeah.
Were you a cult?
No.
I guess nobody who is in a cult says in a cult. But what was the ethos of? Was there?
Was there anything cultish?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. The blink, really, that was really nice. No, but the intentional community that you were talking about, and that resolve that all of you had to actually bring that actually into fruition, was that around a form of a religion, any form of a practice? Or
No, we're not. We don't even all believe that we should be vegetarians. And there are cohousing communities.
No, I'm not talking about vegetarian, but it's
but we don't even have that in common. Do you know what I mean? So what brought the original families together, I think, was just this vision that they're about the anonymity of life in 1990s England. Just a sense that it would be nice. I suppose most of us were living in London, in streets where we probably didn't know very many people, where our friends were scattered about, where the thought was that it'd be quite nice if the children could just go next door, just pop in and pop out, where the whole thing about children being known by a variety of adults and developing those relationships and all that kind of not really being present in the lives that we were living in modern London, and a sense that we would like something else. Whether we were deluded is another, completely another question. But it was that really, and so we weren't even tied together by a drive to live more ecological lives or more spiritual lives, even if that's not a religion. None of that. We had none of that. We just had this idea that we would like to live more integrated lives, or lives where we knew our neighbours much better. Lives where our social life was very, very local and not always involving travel to somewhere else because our friends were scattered about. It was those sorts of things.
And with the people who are coming now, moving in now, do they share the same?
Do they share the same? What brings the people in now? I don't know.
We came in recently, 6 months ago. And I'd say that was what we felt, was that we feels that we wanted something beyond a nuclear family, where there's more space for the children to play. They know other adults well. But I think it is, and for us it was a lot about the space and the children being safe and within. And we've got something more to contribute, I think, than we could in Brighton. We can contribute to a bigger thing. But it isn't a cult.
I said that's a difficult question. So
No. It's and there are, like you said, there isn't diversity, but there are. The people are different. There isn't. People don't conform
And most of the children go to school, you know, outside of the community. There's a couple of home eds, but mostly they go out. So they're, you know, it's not closed in that sense. Mostly people have work which mostly takes them off-site. So that's not closed in that sense either. And we do have events where people come in. So, you know, there's an inflow and an outflow.
Do you have any tips for other people that are setting up groups where they might need to like deal with those kinds of relationships with people who are cold or, you know, with hippies or whatever, you know, dealing with like community?
Yeah, I stay calm. Relatively few things are a matter of life and death. I think that was the thing we really discovered in the first year. You know, after we'd had massive fights over shall we put grass seed down here or lay turf, suddenly realised that actually it's just grass you're talking about. It doesn't really matter that much. There are relatively few things that actually in the end matter that much. So don't feel threatened, and be open to seeing it from other people's point of view, I think. But knowing yourself is actually really, really helpful. So if you know who you are and what you're likely to do and what makes you defensive and when you're going to get angry, that helps you not to do it quite so often to other people, you know. And I think it's the people who perhaps have less insight who find that much more challenging.
Okay. I actually had two questions, if that's okay. First, I was wondering about, because you have a lot of kids around, do you have any like safeguarding like policies? Are you no? But also I was wondering how you deal with conflict, like if there's a grievance between two members, is there a way of dealing with that?
We've talked about it, and there was an attempt to put a sort of formal thing in place, but actually in the end, when people, if the conflict's real, those formal things that tend not to be, have tended, and I know they have them elsewhere, and I know they work quite well, but certainly for us, mostly where the conflict's been real, the people haven't really wanted to engage in those sorts of things. And actually what has worked best is to find a benevolent third party who's got the best interests of both sides to be the one who kind of tries to draw them together. And we have done over the years quite a lot of, there have been several incidents requiring kind of shuttle diplomacy, you know, go to talk to them, and reach some kind of an agreement. But formal dispute resolution we haven't actually done, no.
I've got a question two part. The first was to pick up on what you were saying before about people understanding themselves. How do you encourage people if you see that they haven't got an inclination to find out about that? Because it's actually really good for people in any case, let alone good for people who want to live in an intentional community. And the other part of the question is about opening yourselves out to the surrounding. You said you know people come in, but how do you make yourself part of the wider community?
Well, the first one, I don't think there's much you can do. I think either people start to get it, that it's important that they know themselves a bit, or they don't. And I think there's some people sort of don't, and there you go. But perhaps,
and they go.
Or there you go. You know, that's the way it is. And you know, I don't think there's a great deal that can be done about it. What you do discover is that over 20 years, you know, if you've lived alongside people for 20 years, you start to understand them pretty well. So actually, it's easier to work around them or in the best possible way with them. In terms of the relationship with the outside world, you know, we have done at different times. We've been school governors, we've run the preschool playgroup, we've been on the cricket club committee, we've been parish councillors, we've had summer schemes where 20 kids have come in from the village, we've, you know, run other activities where people have from the village have come in. We have a theatre performance each year where the village is welcome, and we take part in, you know, the fete and the flower show and this sort of thing. So we're out there a lot. When we first moved there, we basically saved the primary school. It was on the verge of the numbers falling too far below viability, so something like 10 or 12 of our children going into it in a 90 kid school was, you know, sufficiently significant to make the difference between staying open and not staying open. And I think that hugely increased our standing in the village. You know, because that kept it going, and then we became school governors and the rest of it as well. So it's those sorts of things really, which I think keep you tied into.
And can I just ask, because just listening to the language you're using, saying the outside world, raises a teeny weeny alarm bell. But do you think that people in the outside world, local community, do you think they would feel the same thing?
That we see them as the outside world?
Yeah, or that would they say, I wish I could really know what was happening, I'd like to, be more involved, or you being more involved with me?
They do see it as slightly different, but then you have to remember that it always was. You've got this really quite small village, which is not a very architecturally cohesive village. There's a fairly main road. It's kind of divided up. It's not a pretty kind of round the duck pond village at all. So it's a kind of scattered village. And then on the edge of it, you've got this massive great hospital, which was both a major employer and a major provider of social activities at its height, and also quite a strange thing sitting there. So it's always been other, and it's quite difficult to go and inhabit it like that without continuing that slight sense of otherness, because it's on the edge of the village, and it's almost as big as the sort of core bit of probably bigger than the core bit of the village. So it's a really strange animal in that sense, and there are still people who remember their parents working there, or remember going there as children. And there has always been a certain sort of, lodge this and lodge that. And if you talk to certainly sort of my child and her generation, they will talk about lodgy children being known as the lodgy children, both at primary and then secondary school. But that didn't stop them having plenty of friends who were not lodgy children. It's a bit like being the kids off the estate, isn't it? It's just where you live.
I also wanted to ask about, you mentioned that you rent out some of the rooms in your common space. Do people, again, is that a way that, are they mostly rented out to people that are in the community, or rented out to people outside the community?
They're mostly rented out internally, but some of them are rented out externally, and so they have been. The Section 106 actually said that they should only be rented out, or anything should only be available for use by people in the parish, which you kind of forget about and no one really notices, but that was,
Right. And do you think you have an impact on, they talked about the employment that the old institution offered. Do you think the Laughton Lodge offers some, does some of the contractors that you use come from the village? Is there any kind of work relationship? Do you provide work in any way?
We obviously do provide work for contractors, and they're quite a lot of them are relatively local, but the village itself is really quite small, so it doesn't make that kind of impact, I don't think, on the village.
What would you say have been the hardest, where has there been conflict, or are there certain key discussions or issues that the community have struggled with?
There has been conflict over, one of the biggest conflicts was over a methodology for charging for heating. But on the whole, we don't have massive conflicts over the methodologies for charging for things. So that was a particular thing that kind of inflamed some passions for some reason I can't really remember. I'm trying to think what the other things have been.
Have there been times when the sense of community has been
lower?
And why is that, or how have you managed to kind of energise it?
It has got lower from time to time. I think a huge amount of it's to do with engagement. So if people start dropping away from engaging with meetings, dropping away from engaging with collective activities, whether that's potluck, which has actually become so the one opportunity to eat collectively has become much more difficult than it was in the first 5 or 6 or 7 years. Has become a much more difficult issue. But if people don't engage with that, or don't engage with the meetings, or don't engage with Busy Day, then you lose the connection with each other, and that's when you start to feel that it's becoming a housing estate in the countryside, and why are we bothering, because it's a much more complicated way of living than if you just paid your own gas bill, and that has usually been changed by some change of personnel, and a new energy comes in where people are keener to re-engage. I mean, I think disengagement is the biggest single problem really. People disengaging either because they've just got tired, or because they've had some kind of a conflict and they've just decided they don't want to be part of it anymore, and then continuing to live there as a sort of lump of non-energy in the middle of it, which I think can be quite difficult. And it's that which tends to reignite the thing about, well, there should be compulsory hours of labour to make sure that everybody is part of it. But I don't think it solves the problem. If you're disengaged, you'll be brought back in by compulsory labour.
Can I ask you, Kim, what you've been there how many months now?
6 months, yeah.
What is the biggest difference it's made for you and your family, do you think?
I mean, it was a big gamble. We realise now what a gamble it was, but it was totally the right gamble to make. We've just been very lucky, and I think the people we've met there have been fantastic. And we can see already that they feel like friends. And they will be friends. And you really, it's a bit exhausting at times when you. Certainly initially, because there's always someone to talk to. There's but I guess you learn how to be able to say, oh, I'd like to have that conversation, but not now, because I'm just walking to the car or something. But I mean, the kids absolutely love it. They're free. They really are free, and what the kids can do as a group, and they become a little tribe, and it's phenomenal, the creativity that comes from that, and the stuff that we do together, like the points of engagement. So the Friday night dinner, we love it, and they love it. They think it is just the best thing. And you can see that sense of belonging already, that they're just like this. This is where we belong. And the busy days, the work together, and they see things change. They really notice it, and I think we moved there, for the kids. A lot of people say, "Oh, you moved there for the kids," but actually, for us, it's been incredibly. It's been wonderful. The social side of it, and I think doing things with other adults that isn't work, because I think quite often you work with people on projects at work. And maybe you've got your own kind of family little projects, but this is something different, and it's really nice to engage with adults in a different way. Yeah. So it's all been thumbs up really. So from us, yeah.
Any more questions, anyone? No? Thank you, Mel.
Brighton and Hove Community Land Trust supports groups of people who want to create their own community-led housing projects. Join us at bhclt.org.uk.